Life has a strange way of pulling the rug out from under you the moment you start to feel stable. Just when everything seems to fall into a comfortable rhythm, something, sometimes subtle, sometimes seismic shifts. That's exactly what happened to me on what I thought would be just another ordinary Thursday night. I had just walked through the front door, the familiar thud of my boots echoing off the tiled floor. The scent of lavender-scented diffuser oil lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the metallic smell of a light drizzle that had begun on my drive home. It had been a long, exhausting day, back-to-back meetings that left no time to breathe, an inbox overflowing with flagged emails, and a rush-hour commute that tested every ounce of my patience. At that point, I had only 3 things on my mind: a generous glass of red wine, a steaming hot shower, and the soft embrace of my favorite throw blanket on the couch. Nothing else, just that quiet, solo ritual I had grown to crave. Drew, my fiancé, had mentioned earlier that he'd be attending a networking event downtown. Something about expanding his connections, staying visible, hustling for that promotion he'd been eyeing for months. We hadn't had dinner together all week. Lately, it felt like we were passing ships, more focused on our individual ambitions than on each other. That meant Aaron, his 19-year-old daughter from a previous relationship, would be home alone. Aaron and I shared a complicated space, cordial but cool. We weren't exactly family, not quite friends, and definitely not confidants. She was polite, quiet, respectful in a distant sort of way. Most evenings, she stayed in her room, sketching or typing away on her laptop for school. Her presence was felt, not heard. I kicked off my boots near the door and headed to the kitchen. The red blend I liked was still sitting on the counter from the night before. I poured myself a glass, relishing the brief silence, the kind that only exists when the whole world seems to have slowed down. As I took the first sip, I glanced out the window. That's when I saw it, her bike, parked beside the porch steps. It struck me as odd. Erin usually had a late shift at the little independent bookstore on Main Street. She never missed a shift. She loved that place. Said it was the only job where she felt seen. So why was her bike here? I called out her name, just loud enough to carry up the stairs. Erin, no response. No creak of floorboards. No hey from her room. No thud of her shutting off music or video. Just silence. Assuming she might have come home early and gone straight to bed, I picked up my wine and started toward the staircase. But as I reached the landing, a soft, persistent sound caught my ear. Running water. I paused outside the bathroom door. It was slightly ajar, not wide open, just enough to see the faint steam escaping into the hallway. The light was on. The faucet was definitely on. My heart gave a little jolt. Erin was obsessively neat about privacy. She always closed doors completely, especially the bathroom. The smallest bit of noise or disruption would set her on edge. Something didn't feel right. I stood there for a moment, glass in hand. Uncertain, my brain began flipping through rational explanations. Maybe she forgot to turn off the water. Maybe she just stepped out to grab a towel. Maybe. But curiosity and a nagging sliver of unease got the better of me. I gently pushed the door open. I pushed the door open a little more and immediately froze. The light from the hallway spilled softly into the bathroom, illuminating a scene I hadn't expected. Erin stood shirtless at the sink, her pajama pants hanging loosely on her hips. A damp washcloth clenched in one hand. Her back was turned to me, her shoulder blades tensed, her body hunched forward like she was trying to disappear into herself. She was scrubbing, frantically, almost violently, at the skin just below her collarbone. And her skin was red, raw, angry, as if she'd been doing this for a while. The door creaked beneath my hand, a quiet betrayal. Erin flinched. She turned sharply, startled, and then her whole body seemed to freeze. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide. "Caught. I didn't hear you come in," she said quickly, her voice breathless with surprise, maybe even fear. I looked away in a flash, my cheeks burning. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude." I was already backing out, trying to give her space, where her voice stopped me cold. "Wait, it's not what you think." There was something in her tone that cut straight through the awkwardness. Not anger, not panic, but something far more rare in Erin: vulnerability. I paused, turned back slowly, eyes carefully trained on her face and nowhere else. "Okay," I said, softening my voice. "Then tell me." She hesitated, her eyes darting to the side. For a second, I thought she'd retreat behind that shell she always wore. But then, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders dropped. She exhaled, as if surrendering to the moment. "I've been breaking out really badly," she whispered. "Not acne, something else. It hurts and it itches and I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to tell Dad. I was scared he'd think it was something worse, or that I'd done something wrong." There it was. The wall cracked, not demolished, but cracked enough for me to see a flicker of who she was underneath. The girl who had always carried herself like she didn't need anyone, finally letting someone in. I stepped inside and gently closed the door behind me, not to trap her, but to give her a moment of dignity, of safety. "Do you want to show me?" I asked, careful not to press, but not retreating either. She nodded. Slowly, she turned around, brushing her damp hair over one shoulder. The rash stretched across her collarbone and crept toward her shoulder. Angry red patches, swollen and irritated, like her skin had been screaming for help and no one had heard. "That looks painful," I said softly, kneeling down beside her. "How long has it been like this?" "A week, maybe more." I reached for the aloe cream on the counter and held it up, asking without words. She nodded again. I applied it gently, dabbing it along the edges of the rash where the skin was hottest. She winced but didn't pull away. Instead, she let out another shaky breath, like the tension she'd been holding for days was finally breaking loose. We sat on the cool tile floor for a while, talking, mostly quietly. She told me how it had started small, how she thought it was just irritation, how it spread, how she'd Googled symptoms and panicked, convinced it was something awful, how she'd scrubbed herself raw, trying to erase what wouldn't go away. "I felt dirty," she admitted, "like my body was betraying me." "You're not dirty," I said, firm but gentle. "And you didn't do anything wrong." She looked at me then, really looked, and something shifted. There was a softness in her gaze I hadn't seen in years. Not since we were kids, maybe. Not since the walls between us were thinner and easier to climb. Trust. Not because I forced it, not because I demanded it, but because for once, she wasn't alone, and that mattered. In the days that followed, something subtle but unmistakable began to change between Erin and me. On the outside, everything appeared the same. Drew continued working late most evenings, often coming home well after dinner. Erin stuck to her routine, attending her classes, picking up shifts at her part-time job, and then disappearing into the sanctuary of her bedroom. But beneath the steady rhythm of our lives, there was movement, gentle and almost imperceptible at first, like tectonic plates shifting beneath calm seas. The atmosphere between us softened, as if an invisible barrier had thinned. Erin started spending more time in the shared spaces of the house. Not much at first, just a few extra minutes in the kitchen, a pause in the hallway, a quiet moment on the porch, but enough for me to notice. And more than that, we began to speak to each other, not just in the polite exchanges we were used to, but in a way that hinted at something deeper, something more real. Then one evening, as we sat side by side on the porch under a sky streaked with the fading colors of dusk, she spoke. "I made a doctor's appointment," she said, almost casually, as she held her glass of iced tea. The words settled in the air between us, heavier than they seemed. I turned to her and smiled. "That's brave. I'm proud of you." She looked down for a moment, stirring the ice with her straw. "Thanks for pushing me," she said quietly. I didn't want to admit I was scared. Her voice trembled just slightly, but the vulnerability in her words was clear. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't really about the rash. It never had been. This was about something far deeper. It was about trust, about allowing someone else to see the parts of you that are uncertain, insecure, or broken, about admitting that you don't have it all together. And in her simple statement, I heard the tentative beginning of something we both had been tiptoeing around: connection. That night stayed with me long after she had gone inside. It marked the beginning of a shift, not just in our relationship, but in her willingness to let me in. A couple of weeks later, Drew surprised us with an idea, a short weekend trip to the coast. Just the three of us. There was hesitation at first. Aaron wasn't sure what to expect, and truthfully, neither was I. But we went. And for the first time, we moved together like something approaching a family. We played board games on the porch of the small rental house, watched the sun dip into the ocean, and shared easy, laughter-filled moments. Aaron joked with Drew. She let herself relax. And one afternoon, she laughed, a full, unguarded laugh, the kind that lights up your whole face. I caught Drew looking at her, his eyes full of quiet gratitude. One night, after Drew had gone to bed, Aaron and I found ourselves still awake, talking on the deck beneath a blanket of stars. She opened up in a way she never had before. She told me about her mom, how much she missed her, how the absence still ached even years later. She confessed her insecurities, the pressure she felt to be strong, and the silent resentment she had carried when I first entered their lives. She admitted how hard it had been to make room for someone new in the shadow of someone she still mourned. It was raw and honest and unfiltered, the kind of conversation that left your heart tender, but also full. When we finally rose to say goodnight, she hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and hugged me. Not awkwardly, not out of obligation, but like she meant it. "I'm glad it was you who walked in that night," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. And in that quiet exchange, beneath the stars and the scent of salt air, I felt the weight of something sacred settle between us. Not resolution, not perfection, but the start of something real, a thread of trust, a sliver of healing, the beginnings of a bond. It's strange, isn't it? How the most pivotal moments in life often tiptoe in rather than explode like fireworks. No dramatic crescendo, no slow-motion revelations, just a quiet shift wrapped in the ordinary. A glance, a pause, a sentence uttered softly in a hallway. In the weeks after the storm, the argument, the silence, the tentative apologies, Aaron and I didn't become best friends. That kind of connection doesn't sprout overnight, especially not from the soil of past misunderstandings. But something began to root, a quiet camaraderie, an unspoken understanding. We were learning each other's rhythms. How she liked her coffee, no sugar, lots of cream. How she hummed when she was nervous. How she'd linger in a room a few seconds longer than necessary, as if weighing whether it was safe to stay. And I, in turn, tried to meet her in those moments, to be a still point when everything else in her world had once felt like motion and noise. Then came an evening that will stay with me forever, not because of grand gestures, but because of its stillness. I was curled up on the couch, lost in a novel, when I heard the creak of the floorboards. Erin stood in the doorway, arms crossed tightly across her chest like she was holding something fragile inside. "Can I talk to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I closed my book and nodded gently. Of course. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then, in a tone filled with trembling resolve, she said, "I think I want to tell Dad. About everything." I blinked, startled not by her words, but by the weight they carried. The everything she meant wasn't just a secret. It was a part of who she was. Something sacred. Something that had lived too long in the shadows. "Are you sure?" I asked softly. She hesitated, then nodded, her eyes clear. "I don't want to hide anymore." I smiled, not to reassure her, but to affirm her courage. "He'll listen," I said. "He loves you, and I'll be right there with you." That night, they sat on the porch, where the summer air hummed with cicadas. I stayed inside, near enough to hear the timbre of their voices, but far enough to let the moment belong to them. I watched Drew's face shift, first confusion, then dawning understanding, and finally, a quiet pride that softened every line of worry. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. Sometimes love is best spoken in silence, in presence. And just like that, we crossed an invisible threshold. No longer just people cohabiting under one roof, navigating the logistics of life. We were something more. A family, not the glossy, magazine cover kind. We had cracks, and we still disagreed over dinner plans and laundry schedules. But we were real, forged not by perfection, but by truth, by grace, and by the willingness to show up, messy, scared, and all in. And sometimes, that's not just enough. It's everything.